Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter 20. For I was uncontrollable. Within seconds, I shifted, my clothes shredding into pieces as I went straight for her jugular vein. But out of nowhere Blaine suddenly appeared and shoved Melissa out of the way, my teeth sinking into his arm as he swiftly pulled his arm up so that I missed my aim at catching Melissa. A harsh growl emitted from deep within his throat, warning me to let go. His eyes afire with fury as he stared down at me. I felt my blood boil as I stayed there for a little longer, only to purposely put more pressure on my jaw, biting him harder before I finally let go. Blaine's glare at me deepened as he knew my wolf was testing him, trying to provoke him like he continuously did to me. "What the fuck is going on?" Blaine yelled, tension filling the air as he waited for an answer. I glared at Melissa, then I turned my glare back onto Blaine. I was still in my wolf form and Blaine was still blocking me out of his mind, refusing to let me in. "I was just walking up the stairs to come find you as there was a problem at the pack house and Kenny saw me walking up the stairs and she just went for me and chased me into your bedroom." Melissa faked sobbed. When Blaine wasn't looking, her lip curled up as she sent a sly smirk my way. Her facial expression tipped me over the edge and once again, I went to lunge at her but Blaine for the second time stopped me. "Stop, Ken, and shift," Blaine shouted harshly using his alpha tone. I shifted and he quickly passed me over a long T-shirt that was sitting on our bed. "What is wrong with you, Blaine? You continually undermine me when that thing," I said as I glared at Melissa, "is in our presence. Is something going on that I should know about?" He rolled his eyes. "How many times do I need to tell you that nothing is going on?" Blaine growled, his voice sounding so calm that I knew how dangerously his tone defeated him. "Then what the fuck is she doing here?" Each word was coming out of my mouth louder than the first one as my blood pressure began to rise. "I don't know," he replied, snarling as he gave me an exasperated look. "Now, doesn't that sound awfully like déjà vu?" I said sarcastically, remembering our last conversation when Melissa was in our home, standing half naked at my front door. "I only came up here to find you as there was a problem at the pack house Alpha," Melissa stated while fluttering her eyelashes at my mate, sending a flirty smile his way. I growled once again, furious at how blatant she was acting in my presence. My jaw was beginning to become sore with how harsh I was clenching it while grinding my teeth together. "Melissa," Blaine began to say, but I couldn't control myself and once again, I shifted. Only this time I managed to knock Melissa down, slamming her into the floor. I was able to dig my claws deep into her cheek. The sweet metallic scent of her blood filled my senses as I attempted to capture her neck in my teeth. Melissa managed to quickly shift under me, and as she was about to lunge at me back we got separated. Blaine began to growl at us both, mind linking our wolves in his alpha tone to shift back as our wolves had both clearly taken over. Blaine gave me a fierce look. "Why do you continue to risk our baby's life, Kenny?" My heart sank the moment he finished his sentence, my eyes widening in worry at the information he had just shared in front of Melissa. I stared at him like a deer in headlights, biting on my bottom lip as my stomach began to churn with uneasiness. His face suddenly mirrored mine once he realized what he had said. It went deadly silent. It wasn't that I cared that she knew. It was that I had no idea who she could share the information with or what she could do with that information. "Did I hear you correct? You're pregnant," Melissa spat out, her tone filled with animosity. Chapter 25. Blaine's presence rapidly changed as he stood straight, his stance turning intimating as he took a step closer to Melissa. He growled darkly at her, warning her to listen as he captured her attention while taking it off of me. "This information stays between us. It is not information you are allowed to share. If you fail to do so, I will carry out the threat I promised before." From the dark look in his eyes, his wolf was definitely looking at the surface. His eyes had changed from emerald green to pitch black, His eyes narrowed on Melissa as his wolf took over, using his authority as an alpha to command her to abide by his rules and demands. His words reminding me of the day that I'd stopped him from taking her life as he dangled her by the scruff of her shirt as she sat in a prison cell months ago. "Don't you have a mate to be with?" Blaine asked. His voice sounded calm, but you could hear the deadly tone in his voice as he raised his eyebrow in question. Melissa continued her silence but stared at my mate. "You can go, but don't forget what I said." He snarled murderously, a warning that he would only give once. Melissa's eyes wandered from Blaine's to mine. She held my gaze, her eyes lingering for a moment before she finally left, stepping out of my bedroom. Her footsteps echoing as she walked quickly down the stairs, the front door slamming as she left the house. I sighed as if I hadn't taken a breath in minutes. The whole situation had made me feel extremely anxious, my fingers instantly coming up to my mouth as I began biting my nails. An awful habit of mine for when I was nervous. Blaine turned to me as he regained control from his wolf. "Ken, I don't know what that was all about, but I promise you nothing will happen to the baby. She wouldn't dare do or say anything." Blaine promised, a slight growl whispering over his voice as his hands came up to my shoulders, holding me in place, attempting to reassure me as he pulled my body to his. His touch sent tingles throughout my body as I laid my head of his chest while he embraced me. I pulled back slightly, still needing him to explain what just happened. "Why was she here again, Blaine?" I questioned, feeling frustrated and exhausted. "Ken, I know as much as you do. I was in the bathroom. I have no idea why she was here. All she mentioned was a problem at the pack house." He repeated what Melissa had told us. I could hear the sincerity in his voice, but I pushed a little further, wanting to satisfy my wolf fully. "You promise, as this is not the first time you have found yourself in this predicament." He pulled me back, his hands cupping both sides of my face as he looked at me intensely. "I swear on our pup's life." I nodded, knowing that he was sincere, his words genuine. He pulled me over to the bed, forcing me to sit on his lap. "Look, I shouldn't have acted the way I did on Gabriel's territory. I was shocked that my mate would hide the fact that she was pregnant." He sighed deeply. "Is that your way of apologizing?" Teasing him, I didn't want to continue arguing. He sent me a sexy smirk back, a teasing smile plastered on his face. "It's the best you're going to get," he whispered in my ear, amusement clear in his voice as he nibbled slightly on my ear. My face mirrored his. He suddenly kissed me on my lips, that kiss intensifying more and more. He stood up, picking me up with him. My legs wrapped round his waist as he turned us around, placing me gently on the bed as we continued to kiss. I attempted to suppress a moan when he began kissing my jaw, slowly moving down towards my neck. His hands teasingly moved down my body as he began to remove my clothing. I was getting very hot and bothered, and he knew it, his grin never fading as he began to undress. A few weeks went by, and I had found myself getting more exhausted as the weeks went on. It was definitely pregnancy symptoms. Blaine and I were due to have an appointment with our pack doctor George at 2 p.m. I was extremely eager to find out the gender of our baby, which we would find out later today. My excitement showed as I walked into the kitchen to find Lena singing as she made a cup of coffee. Her mate, Liam, sat on a kitchen stool as he watched his mate with loving eyes. Both their attention landed on me. "Morning, Kenny," Lena smiled as she raced over to me, gently placing her hands on my protruding belly. "I bet you can't wait to find out the gender." Blaine won't admit it, but I know he is. I grinned. I couldn't help but show my excitement as I smiled brightly, her face echoing mine. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm," I replied just as my mate walked in. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." he said as he kissed both Lena and I on the cheek before nodding at Liam, who nodded back. As excited as I was to find out the gender, I was also petrified. My baby is yet to kick, which was abnormal for a wolf. We should be able to feel our baby move once it's hit week's mark, but then again, nothing in this pregnancy was normal. The doctor was still unable to explain why my pregnancy had no scent, but he had promised the baby was well and healthy. Blaine and I only shared the news to a few trustworthy wolves. Blaine had a lot of enemies, and it wasn't worth the risk sharing the news with our pack until the baby had been born. You must let me know the moment you know the baby's gender. I can't wait to go shopping and spoil my grandbaby. Lena squealed as she looked between Blaine and me. Blaine and Liam both laughed while rolling their eyes. I smiled brightly at her. Blaine caught my gaze. We should probably get going. The appointment is soon. I nodded and grabbed his hand as we said our goodbyes to Lena and Liam. We walked towards the pack house, cutting through the woods where the infirmary was. We were greeted by wolves the moment we stepped into the pack house. Blaine gently guided me down the corridor, opening the infirmary door as we strolled in to find George waiting, typing vigorously on his computer. He turned, smiling at both of us but not quite reaching Blaine's gaze. "Good afternoon, Alpha," he said before turning to me. "Luna." He greeted before gesturing to the hospital bed. "Hello," I greeted back as I pulled myself onto the bed, carefully pulling my top up for the doctor to place some warm gel on my belly as Blaine stood next to me, facing the ultrasound machine screen, waiting patiently for up on the screen. He had yet to see our baby properly, since the last appointment ended with my father's infirmary being destroyed. This would be the first time Blaine would see our baby. I knew he was just as eager as me, but he always suppressed his emotions. It was rare to see him share any other emotion than anger. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." The pack doctor questioned. I looked up to see Blaine in deep thought. He was staring intently at the screen as George gently glided the ultra-scan device over my belly while pressing buttons on his computer. Knocked out of his deep thoughts, he stared at the doctor. "Yes. You both ready to know the gender?" George questioned with a grin on his face. I looked at Blaine, a spreading across my face as I looked to my mate. Blaine grinned back, making my smile even bigger. "Yes, we are," Blaine replied, a light laugh following as we both waited impatiently for the result. My heart melted as I watched my mate's reaction to our baby's gender. Chapter 26. "A baby girl," Blaine repeated. George smiled, nodding. "A little girl," he confirmed, typing away at his computer. Blaine's smile was infectious, and I rarely got to see it, but when I did, it made my stomach flutter with butterflies. "I have printed out a few scan photos for you to keep. We need to arrange another appointment for a few weeks to see how the baby is doing," George said as he handed me an envelope with the scans in. "There's a few concerns that I have," I began. "I have still yet to feel her movement, as you know already. I have no pregnancy scent." George looked at me and bit on his bottom lip. "I'm not sure why you have no scent, but all babies are different. I can tell on the scans that she is very much healthy. Hopefully, she'll start moving around soon," reassuring me. I pulled my top down as I began moving from the hospital bed, hearing Blaine thank the doctor before pulling me out of the infirmary and through the pack house. He held my hand. We both stayed silent, knowing that there were plenty of ears in the pack house and we were yet to announce our pregnancy news. As we began walking through, I caught the sight of Melissa, sitting on the couch, her eyes moving from the television to catch my gaze. The last 2 weeks had been awkward. She knew my secret that I had strangely noticed that I had been seeing her more often. Whereas before I barely noticed her, she seemed to always be around, and it was beginning to feel uncomfortable. She would smirk at me, or give me a look as if she knew something I didn't. I decided it was best not to mention it to Blaine. It would only make the situation worse, but as we began to step out of the pack house, she continued to hold my gaze, until her eyesight concentrated intently at my belly, a sly smirk appearing on face as she looked straight back into my eyes. My stomach churned a little in concern, but once again I brushed it off as Blaine gently guided me down the steps. We were sitting in Blaine's office when the phone began ringing. Blaine looked at it. "It's your father," he said, pursing his lips in confusion and slight irritation before picking the phone up. I was currently sitting on Blaine's lap and I sat very still as I attempted to listen to their conversation. "Blaine, it's Gabriel," my father greeted on the other end. "All right, Gabriel. How can I help you?" My mate greeted back, his voice slightly tense. They were both trying to get along for my sake. "First off, congratulations on having a baby girl. Kenny mentioned that you found out the gender on Sunday." I could hear the happiness in his voice. He was just as excited as we were. Blaine looked at me, before answering. "Thank you." He was a man of few words, so he left the congratulations as that. "What did you want to talk about anyway?" I knew exactly what it was. The other day when I phoned my parents to let them know the news about the baby, my father had mentioned that Pierce was due to have a meeting with him on Saturday afternoon. He wondered if it would be a good idea to invite Blaine and I, so we could all discuss Blaine's to overtake Pierce's territory. It was unnecessary and ridiculous. It was a war that wasn't needed. Blaine had enough land, but he always craved more. I agreed with my father. With a baby on the way, there was no need to start a war. My dad told me he would speak with Pierce first, to see if he would agree to a meeting, then he would phone Blaine. "I have a suggestion, an invitation, for you and Kenny to come to my territory. I have the Stone Warriors pack and the Storm Warriors pack attending on Saturday. I merely thought it would be a good idea for you to come and have a discussion on your plans. With a baby on the way, Blaine, is it worth causing a war over Pierce's territory?" My mate sighed loudly, an irritated growl emitting from his throat. "I appreciate the thought, but no, I have already made up my mind. My plans will be going ahead. At the moment they are on hold until my daughter's birth." His voice sounded stern, not wanting my father to argue back or comment further. But with my father being an alpha, he continued, "Do you not think the best thing for your mate and child is to have a discussion about it like last time, just minus our wolves?" My father said, an amused laugh echoing through the phone. "Or better yet, discussion which ends this idea of yours." Blaine looked at me and rolled his eyes in aggravation. I had mentioned the idea to him the other day. I told him about my conversation with my father, as I knew he would be difficult to persuade without me pushing him a little, otherwise it would have been that out no. He was furious with the idea at first, but after a long conversation, he reluctantly agreed. It was clear that he was still unhappy with the idea, but he promised my father that we would arrive on Friday, to be settled and ready for the arrival of the Alphys on Saturday. Once the phone ended, Blaine phoned Benjamin. I decided to leave, leaving my mate to speak to his grandfather, filling him in on the situation. As I walked out, I heard Blaine ask Benjamin if he wanted to come, to which he agreed. It was Wednesday now, and I had to pack a few things ready for Friday. The week went by quickly, with Lena and Liam showering us with baby gifts. Blaine and I agreed that we would sort out the baby's room within the next 2 weeks. Blaine was tense on the way there, his muscles seeming more tense and prominent than normal. His aura was intimating, making us all feel on edge. Our pack wolves were avoiding him at all costs unless they needed to speak to him. He stood there while I unpacked our belongings in a bedroom my mom had made up for us, as it meant we would be close by to pack warriors and enforcers instead of staying in my bedroom. I stepped onto the bed, yanking the blankets up to keep myself warm. "You okay?" I questioned Blaine. He was more quiet than normal. It made me feel slightly uncomfortable. He nodded, while not staring at me. He suddenly got into bed, grabbing me, carefully pulling my body against his, and with that, we both fell asleep, leaving me anxious about what was to come tomorrow. I laid in bed listening to the sound of water as it pattered against the shower walls as Blaine occupied the bathroom. We had both woken up late, and from the time on the clock, Alpha Piers Stone was due to arrive any minute. I stood at the bay of my window, staring out, suddenly interested. I laid my hand gently on the top of my protruding belly as I watched for cars arrive in the driveway. I was oddly intrigued, and I couldn't bring my eyes to look away until I felt a strong kick which made me instantly rub my belly. Blaine must have felt my shock through our bond as he was swiftly next to me. I hadn't noticed that he had exited the bathroom until I felt his hand over mine. I smiled widely. It was the first time my baby had kicked. I pulled Blaine's hand to where I had last felt her kick, and once again she kicked powerfully into her father's hand, making a smile appear on his face as he kissed my lips and stared out the window. "We should go down," he said as he stared outside, a dark, dangerous look flashing in his eyes before looking down at my clothes. "Quickly shower and we'll go down together." I nodded. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." After showering and changing, we began making our way down. Blaine's body went stiff as my mom opened the front door, welcoming the Stone Warrior's pack. He stood next to me in a protective manner, his body slightly in front of mine. Piers stepped in first. He was undeniably handsome with his dark hair and stubble, but nothing compared to my mate. The tension in the air was excessive. It was deadly silent as Blaine and Piers made eye contact. Blaine seemed to stand a little taller, his face consorting into a dark smirk which made everyone but Piers cower. Piers's facial expression echoed Blaine's, a loud growl emitted from his mouth as they were suddenly a couple of feet apart. Piers's beta was suddenly next to them, standing as a buffer between them. I placed my hand on Blaine's arm, his stance relaxing a little before he pulled me closer to him. At that point, Piers backed up, allowing everyone space as wolves began entering the house. It was quiet until the sound of a young woman's voice suddenly caught everyone's attention. "Maverick, slow down," a woman's voice demanded, but with a soft tone, but you could practically see the scowl on her face. It captured everyone's attention. All eyes were focused on the front door as a young boy around 4 or 5 walked in, and yanking who I assumed was his mother behind him, staring at me for a moment before walking over and reaching for me. I bent down a little, and the moment I did, his hands went straight to my belly as he growled softly. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Chapter 27. A few gasps were heard as we all stared at the young boy, holding on to my belly gently. He stood staring at me fiercely, but not in anger, but adamant that I was carrying his mate. I looked up at Blaine, who was staring down at Maverick intensely before staring back at me, just as confused as I was. "How is this possible?" I said out loud, a question that was swirling around my mind again and again. My daughter began kicking, which made the young boy hold tighter, moving his small hands to follow her kicks. "No," Blaine stated, staring down at Maverick. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Maverick repeated no. Blaine demanded, his voice tight and insistent. His eyes splitting into slits as he stared down at the young boy as Maverick's expression echoed his. Blaine lowly growled in warning. From the look on his face, he could kill. His anger showed, and I moved to stand up as Maverick's mother, who I now realized was Piers's mate, grabbed him, pulling him beside her. "Have you told your son to do this?" Blaine snarled mercilessly as he glared accusingly at Piers. "How would he know of mates? He's not even 16 yet. He's a pup." Piers glared back at him, just as ferociously. "I guess we all have a lot to talk about. If this is your idea of trying to get me to change my mind, You are utterly mistaken. Blaine kept eye contact with Pierce as both their eyes glazed over, their wolves both coming to the surface. It only fuels me more. He taunted, a smirk plastering his face as his wolf took control once again. Stop. To my agent extraordinaire, Myelin Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. My hand reaching for Blaine's arm once again. This conversation is not happening right now, I demanded, as I looked towards Maverick. He was far too young to be in eyesight or in listening view. Maverick continued to stare at my belly. His mother was holding him in place, but I could tell how restless he was to be near me. Let's move this to the dining hall, my mother began. She was in as much shock as I was. Go through that door on the left. As I was about to walk through the door, I waited as Blaine stopped the young boy getting through. He's not coming into this meeting. He lowly growled as he grabbed the top of Maverick's head, forcing him to turn back in the opposite direction. Maverick, come with me. I'll take you to the pack house. My mother intervened, diffusing the situation, and looked at Pierce for his approval. He sent my mother a nod, and ordered 3 of his wolves to follow. I watched on as Maverick hesitated. He was staring at me as if he was battling with himself. It was a strange thing to see, since the boy could not have shifted already. Go with the Luna, Maverick, his father ordered sternly. He followed my mom, as she pulled him along in the direction of the pack house. Once we were all the room with our pack wolves, including Pierce's beta, who stood behind him. My father suddenly made an appearance. He greeted Pierce and his mate Ava, before we all sat down. My mom and dad were sitting to the side of us as Blaine and I faced Pierce and Ava. I could tell by the look on my dad's face that my mom had updated him via their mind link. There was so much tension in the room. It was awkward. How could this be possible? How could such a young boy know his mate? Wolves were unable to do that until after they have shifted at the age of 16. You want to explain what all that was about? Blaine's voice was tight, but he was the first to break the silence. Pierce sighed as he looked at Blaine, then moved to mine before speaking. On Maverick's first birthday, he suddenly started having a seizure. At least, that's what we believed it was, Pierce recalled. He would cry in agony whenever we touched him. Bava just wanted to comfort our pup, but it only seemed to hurt him. Ava looked up sadly at her mate, remembering the pain her baby was in. We called our pack doctor and he immediately told us to bring him to the infirmary. We didn't even, he was confused. We stayed there for hours where he was being monitored. All he would do was cry, I've commented. It wasn't until a few hours later that we realized he was shifting. My little baby was suddenly staring at me through his wolf form. Blaine and I glanced at each other. How can that happen? He's too young to shift. Staring at Eva, we thought the exact same. Not even our pack doctor knew why. It wasn't until we did some digging and spoke to a few elders that we realized that our son had a rare gift. That rare gift also applies to his mate, Pierce added, looking at Blaine. They can both shift at the age of 1, smell and meet their mate at any age, and they both are able to communicate with each other without a mark. So they don't need to mark each other or mate? My father inquired, confused. Blaine's head swirled to my dad within a second, giving him a deadly look. We are not talking about that. My daughter isn't even here yet. We are not talking about mating. My daughter will not be doing that. I attempted to hold in my laugh, but I couldn't help stop it from escaping my mouth. To answer your question, Pierce began. They won't get the uncontrollable urge to mark or mate until they're 16. Although they do get all the other symptoms of finding their mate, except they are unable to feel each other's emotions. Blaine glared at Pierce. A growl rumbled from deep in his chest as he was suddenly overwhelmed with the feeling of jealousy and protectiveness. So, There's no separating them. I turned towards him, placing my hand over his. You can't separate mates, Blaine. You know this. I answered him, giving him a pointed look. He frowned. His body began shaking, and he was still clenching his teeth. How can a 4-year-old claim his mate before she's even born? I haven't even held my daughter yet. He huffed angrily. This is going to be very testing. My father agreed, nodding his head. It won't be, because it's not happening, Blaine replied, his tone tight. His hands turning white from how tight his fists against the table. I looked at my mate, slightly disgusted with his words. No, Blaine, it is happening. He briefly looked at me before he directed his gaze to Pierce. Your son will stay away from my daughter until she's at least 16. Blaine, I narrowed my eyes on him. You don't get to dictate in this situation. He's part of our daughter's life now, and that's the end of the conversation. I was gritting my teeth. I was infuriated by his behavior. He's too old for her, he began, but Pierce butted in. He's just over 4 years old, Blaine. He's not 40. His words coming out sarcastic, and he included an eye roll. Before Blaine could lose his shit, I grabbed him once again, directing his attention back to me. You're older than me, Blaine. Plus, you heard Pierce. They won't have the urge to mark or mate until they are both 16. You can't separate them now. It would be like you being separated from Kennedy. Added. It's a difficult situation for both families. Our pups will struggle to be apart, meaning that we will probably have to come to an arrangement. She looked at me with a small smile. An arrangement as in both pups having authority to stay on each of your territories for periods of time. My mother questioned. I looked at my mom and nodded a little. I could see she was getting a little emotional over it. At that point, I thought it would be best to stop the conversation as the atmosphere was getting heavy. Look, let's discuss this more tomorrow. There's a lot for us all to take in. Thankfully, everyone agreed and the conversation ended after that. We were yet to discuss what we had actually came here to do. Benjamin and Tatum were both being held back by related issues and both decided that they would arrive tomorrow, so another meeting would take place then. My parents took Pierce and Ava to the pack house to get food along with the wolves they brought with them, including ours. Blaine followed them and told me to go upstairs and rest, which I gladly agreed to. Not long later, Blaine brought some food up to our room for me, and we sat there in bed watching television. We decided it would be better to discuss everything relating to Maverick once we were back home. It allowed us both time to think about it. But I did make one thing clear. He was not going to push out daughter's mate away, and after an argument, he reluctantly agreed. Blaine decided he would go for a run. His wolf was restless and continued to stay on the edge, his temper still flaring. By Blaine's aura, I could tell he needed to run off some steam. There was a knock on the door. I checked the time on the clock on the wall. It was nearly 8 p.m., and I was already tucked in bed in my pajamas. I shuffled out of the bed, opening the door to see Ava and Maverick standing there. I smiled at the pair of them. Hi, I know this might sound funny, but Maverick has been begging me to come see you before he goes to bed. She rubbed her hand through his hair as he looked towards me with pleading eyes. You want to come in? I opened my bedroom door further, gesturing for them to come in. Blaine has just gone for a run, so he won't be back for a while. I sat on the bed along with Ahi and Maverick. I could see the eagerness dance in his eyes as he waited patiently for me to call him over. Want to touch my belly? He looked up at his mom, before his eyes landed back on mine. He crawled over to me. I moved a little for him to hug my belly. Papa Undeich added while Maverick occupied himself by touching my belly. He had gotten so comfortable that he had fallen asleep as he gripped the bottom hem of my t-shirt. I should get him to his own bed. Ava laughed as she watched her son snuggle close to me. If I don't, I think your mate might drag him away from you. A small laugh escaped my lips, but as I attempted to gently move away from Maverick, his grip only seemed to latch on tighter. I laughed. Maverick can't stay here for the night. He's comfortable and my daughter seems to be happy as it's the first time all day that she hasn't been kicking me like crazy. Are you sure? I don't want to cause any problems. If he gets in the way, you can bring him back to me. She was hesitant to leave him here. She was worried with how Blaine would act. I can always carry him back to you if needs be. Blaine will be fine. You sure? She repeated. Her eyes suddenly glazed over, and I could tell she was mind-linking with Pierce. I waited to speak, and once she was back in our conversation, she spoke again. We are happy for him to stay, but if anything happens to him, she began, but I interrupted, knowing exactly what she meant. My wolf didn't appreciate where her words were going, but we both understood, and decided to let it go. He will be fine. He's my daughter's mate after all. My hand lightly stroking the hair out of Maverick's face. Once I had settled her worries, Arva left after kissing her son on his head and wishing me a good night. The door shut quietly and I soon found myself falling asleep, my daughter's young mate, clinging to me. About an hour or so later, I felt the bed dip. I turned to see Blaine looking at me. He rolled his eyes before leaning over and staring at Maverick with a closed-off expression. He's lucky I'm letting him be so close to my mate and daughter. There was a slight threat to his voice, and I could feel his body was tense next to mine. This is a one-night thing, he demanded, his voice stern. A small smile creeped up on my lips from his comment, and I had to bite the insides of my mouth to stop a full-on grin from showing. If this was a couple of months ago, Blaine wouldn't have even considered the idea. He was slowly changing, and for that, I was happy. I turned round and kissed him on the lips, which seemed to loosen his muscles. Blaine then circled his arm under my head, and I moved my body slightly to get comfortable in his arms. Maverick had somehow gone from his head being at the top of the bed on a pillow, to halfway down the bed with his forehead leaning gently on my stomach. Gently pulling him up towards me, to get him into a better, more comfortable position. Maverick hummed as I moved him, his little arms landing on my stomach as he cuddled tight to my chest. He's dead lucky, Blaine warned, as he lowly growled in my ear. Chapter 28. Tatum and Benjamin had both arrived along with a few wolves they brought with them, and we were all currently sitting in my father's dining hall as his office was too small to hold the meeting due to the amount of wolves who had arrived with each alpha. The atmosphere felt extremely tense, and with so many alphas in the same room, it was almost overwhelming. Benjamin took a seat next to Blaine, with me to the left of him. My mom and dad had both sat on the same side of us, while Pierce, Harvey and Tatum sat on the opposite side facing us. Blaine informed me this morning that he had phoned Benjamin last night and had explained the situation we have regarding Maverick. Benjamin was cautious and made it very clear. So I've heard that a certain young alpha is my granddaughter's mate. It sounded like a question but came out like a statement, and it was aimed at Pierce, his eyes glowing. Like Blaine, he was concerned that this could be a trick and it wasn't something they were going to accept lightly. There was a possibility that Pierce had encouraged his son into this. Pierce looked towards us all, his answer aimed at everyone. We wasn't expecting this as much as you. His tone was stern. I could see his wolf flickering through his eyes. It was clear that his wolf was feeling insulted at the insinuation. His attention suddenly landed on Blaine's, his question aimed at him. You honestly believe that I would encourage and force my son to be mated to your daughter? His voice was low and sounded harsh. Especially if I have to deal with you. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Blaine growled darkly, feeling disrespected by his question, and from the dark look on his face I knew his wolf was lurking just below his control, ready to take over the minute he gave in. His jaw clenched as his eyes switched to black, indicating his anger. Did you? Blaine's tone sounded deadly as he raised his eyebrow at Pierce. Pierce rolled his eyes, as he glared back just as cold. No, Blaine, and I think my last comment said it all. We are both as shocked as you are. This was completely unexpected. Eva quickly added as she leaned into Pierce slightly, wanting comfort as the tension in the room intensified. We came here for one reason, and that was to discuss this ridiculous plan of yours. Pierce said, his voice sounding nonchalant. Blaine abruptly stood up, his wolf still fully in control. His breathing was heavy and profound rage was filling up his chest as he glared down at Pierce, who remained calm. His jaw clenched as he spits out. And what makes you think that I haven't got wolves minutes away from your territory prepared to attack the moment I give them my command? I felt my heart beat quicker, as if all my blood had run from my cheeks. I knew what my mate was capable of, and I was concerned by his words. I looked up questionably towards Blaine, who continued to stare at Pierce with a teasing smirk plastered on his face. Pierce instantly stood up, growling menacingly at Blaine, his own wolf taking control. Both their bodies were shaking with anger. It looked as if they were both in midshift. They stood only a few meters away from each other, only a table situated between them keeping them apart. Blaine had his hands curled into fists as Pierce clenched his jaw. I reached up, grabbing Blaine's hand, which he gripped back but refused to look at me as he stared back at Pierce just fierce as before. In the corner of my eye I could see Eva doing the same thing, attempting to calm her mate down, but neither alpha was willing to back down. Look, my father stepped in, his own alpha tone spilling through. This conversation is for our humans only. This is a conversation, not a fight. I watched as Pierce slowly sat down, agreeing, and Blaine followed, but neither of them was letting their eyes sway anywhere but each other. I didn't think Blaine was being serious. He was teasing in a threatening way, something he did often to enrage other wolves, but in the back of my mind, I wondered. So, now what? Pierce growled lowly at Blaine. I'm not going to sit here and argue with you, Blaine. You're either going to attempt to take my territory and start a war, or you're not. So what's it going to be? Blaine ignored Pierce and continued to smirk at him. I was beginning to worry that his teasing threat earlier might be true. Blaine? I questioned, my voice showing my concern, but I didn't care. He took his eyes off of Pierce and looked down at me and said nothing but gripped my hand tighter. Tatum breathed in deeply and sighed. Why don't we move this outside? Maybe showing you Maverick in his wolf form will change your mind, he questioned. After all, he is your daughter's mate. It was his turn to smirk back at Blaine. Before Blaine could say anything, I interrupted him before his temper would flare. He had been trying so hard over the past few weeks to control his temper, and I didn't want this situation to turn it around. I didn't want him to go back to the cold, ruthless alpha he was a few months ago. I think that's a really good idea. I was slightly skeptical about the whole situation, but Maverick had showed me a few signs which could mean it really was possible and true. Eva nodded and smiled. I'll quickly go get in. We all moved outside, everyone waiting patiently as Eva brought Maverick outside, and he ran immediately outside and stood next to me to Blaine's dismay. Maverick, his father called, bending down next to his son. I need you to shift to your wolf. He used his alpha tone on him, and within a few seconds his clothes dripped off and he stood there on all fours. I was shocked, yet amazed that he could actually shift. I felt Blaine go stiff next to me, his muscles going tight as he stared down at him questionably. He suddenly moved a few steps away before shifting into his own wolf. Maverick moved, going slightly behind me, his wolf struggling from mating aura that Blaine radiated in his wolf form. I scowled at Blaine irritably. Blaine, stop doing that. I knew he was purposely not holding back his authority from anyone, especially not to Maverick. Pierce glared at Blaine, coming to stand in front of him and to the side of me. He's too young for you to be staring at him like that, Pierce growled at Blaine. Blaine once again completely ignored him and rolled his eyes, but this time he was focused on me. It's amusing to see Pierce get so wound up. Blaine's comment appeared through our mind link, meaning no one else could hear. Blaine, I repeated, unimpressed, but I accidentally replied out loud. A low and small growl emitted from Blaine's mouth. Within a second, I felt Maverick's small head squeeze through my legs as he began glaring at Blaine. He attempted to growl, but it sounded more like a weak bark, which made me bring my hand up to my mouth while I laughed. Maverick, get here. Ava commanded, but instead Maverick pushed the rest of his small wolf form through my legs and ran over to Blaine, who sat there on his hind legs, clearly entertained. Maverick continued to bark as he approached Blaine. The gesture was warding Blaine away from me, which I found adorable and made many of us chuckle. Pierce and Ava were telling the truth, and deep down I always knew from the moment Maverick touched my belly. Blaine suddenly stood up on all fours. Maverick's little body was tiny compared to Blaine, and he jerked forward attempting to frighten him, but Maverick didn't flinch and stood his ground. Blaine looked at me and I knew exactly what he was thinking. He was impressed, not that he would ever admit that out loud, but even in his wolf form I could see his smirk. Maverick began running around trying to tempt Blaine into a game of chase, but he wasn't having any of it. He just watched on amused at the young pup until he got too close, and Blaine purposely pushed his paw on Maverick, causing him to fall over on his side, causing everyone to chuckle as Maverick growled weakly at him. We all stood there for a while discussing Maverick and his gift and how it would affect my daughter. Blaine stayed in his wolf form, listening intently to our conversation, but continued to watch Maverick. He was interested in what the pup could do. Not long later, both Blaine and Maverick must have felt my gaze, as they both turned around, giving me their full attention. I smiled at my mate. I know you hate the thought of it, but he is clearly our daughter's mate, and you can't his mate, and you can't take him away from her. You can't jeopardize her mate bond. You know you can't, I said through our mind link. He didn't reply. Instead, he looked at me and lifted his gaze to Maverick. Blaine was standing still when Maverick came bundling across the clearing towards me. Blaine let out a loud warning growl, telling him to slow down. Maverick slowed immediately and came to a heavy halt. He looked back to my mate as if asking for permission to approach before he stopped right next to my feet. He laid his head and his belly on my toes, the warmth of his fur keeping my feet warm through my socks as my feet were getting too swollen to wear trainers. He looks exhausted, I commented, looking down at him. Ava suddenly appeared. Sorry about Maverick, she said as she leaned down, pulling her son up into her arms where he was in his wolf form. I smiled and waved off a comment before reaching my hand out while he was in Ava's arms, gently stroking the fur behind deer. Blaine must have shifted and changed before I could notice. He approached us and looked towards Pierce. I would just have to take over the East Territory, Blaine said, his voice coming out tense. Pierce looked taken back and shocked, including my father, who frowned as if he had heard Blaine incorrectly. I stood there quietly, grinning at my mate, who sent me back a small smile. I knew it took him everything to say and to accept that Maverick was his daughter's mate. Starting a war would only hurt his family, which was one thing Blaine had always promised not to do. This wasn't the same Blaine as before, and I couldn't be more proud of how much he has changed over the past few months, and his pup definitely had everything to do with it. Pierce didn't say anything but nodded and held out his hand, which Blaine accepted. Monday arrived quickly and it was time for everyone to go back to their territories. Last night, we had agreed with Pierce and Dava that Maverick had permission to be on our territory a couple of days a week, where we would look after him. Ava looked a little worried, but her mate helped calm her, as it was clear she didn't want to leave her pup in an unknown territory. It was the best thing for Maverick, as his wolf would only be restless, and it was important for him to bond with our daughter. With him being so young, he's not able to fully control his wolf properly, and being around me would help control him. Maverick didn't want to let go of me when it was time for us both to leave and go to our separate territories, but I promised him that I would see him soon, and he begrudgingly got in his father's car. We were close to our territory and I watched closely, staring into the woodlands. I could see a few of our pack wolves chasing our car through the woods, making me smile. The moment we crossed our border, I suddenly felt an overwhelming feeling of fear and anxiety. I could feel that the hairs on my arms had raised, and I quickly brushed my hand up and down my arms to stop the goosebumps. Blaine looked at me from the driving seat, his eyebrows frowning in concern, but I brushed it off and sent him a small smile, which seemed to satisfy him. I wasn't sure what was making me feel so afraid, but deep down in the back of my mind, I knew I would find out soon. Chapter 29. Time had been passing by quickly. It had been nearly a month since we came home from my father's territory. I was a few days from being in the 13th week of my pregnancy, meaning I only had 3 more to go. To say I was petrified would be an understatement, but with Blaine and Maverick by my side, it was easier. Maverick had been staying on our territory a lot over the past few weeks. Our arrangement with Pearson today was that we would have him on our territory from Monday to Wednesday, but it always seemed to be an uphill battle every time it came to him going home. He would throw a complete toddler strop, kicking up a big fuss until Blaine lost his temper. It was a complex situation, as it was only going to get worse the longer it went on, and with our daughter yet to be born, Blaine was beginning to get even more frustrated. We were all concerned that it would get to a point where they would have to stay together constantly, just like the mate bond intends. We were due to speak to Pierce tomorrow, as Maverick was due to arrive here in a few days. We decided to keep ourselves occupied and to start decorating the baby's room. Her room was going to be in the room opposite ours, and we decided to keep it all neutral colors. Once Blaine and a few other wolves had finished the painting, we began to build up all the wardrobes and other essentials we needed fixing up before she was due. I shrugged my shoulders and turned to look at my mate. Blaine, we need to decorate a room for Maverick too, especially as he will be staying often. Maybe in the room next to our daughters, I suggested. Blaine and I had still not decided or agreed on names yet. We thought that it would be best to choose closer to the time, as we still had a couple of weeks, and we only bickered when the conversation came up. Blaine looked up at me. He was fiddling with a screwdriver as he began fixing up a wardrobe. He immediately rolled his eyes, but I knew deep down he was teasing. He was beginning to like Maverick as much as he detested the whole situation. He was just being overprotective of his daughter. His room is not going to be anywhere near my pups. A serious expression on his face, and pursed his lips as if he was thinking about something. He can have the room down the hall, the one next to my office. It was my turn to roll my eyes, as I stared at Blaine, giving him an exasperated expression. Blaine, don't be ridiculous. I laughed, amused at how petty he was being. He still refuses to get over the fact that his daughter has already been claimed before he was even able to hold his baby girl. I passed him over another screw as I looked over instructions. We also need him to be close. He's our daughter's mate, and he will be an alpha when he's older. We need to protect him whilst he's in our care. I added, Alpha and Pierce had trusted us to look after their son whilst he was in our territory, like we will lead to with our daughter eventually. He growled a little, and huffed. He was unhappy with the situation, which I understood, but he needed to accept the fact that this was happening and he couldn't change it. He could have the one next door, but I'm putting a lock on the outside of his door so he can't be sneaking into my daughter's room at night without me knowing. Blaine. I laughed, saying his name while my smile ached at his comment. He sat there with a smirk on his face, still sending me a teasing smile, but I knew deep down he meant it, which made me laugh even harder. Once we had finished fixing up the cupboard, Blaine and I went downstairs to have some dinner. I was starving and I could smell that Lena had made something delicious. We sat there with Lena and Liam. Eventually Adrian showed up. His beta duties meant that he was very busy and often away on pack business, especially now that I was pregnant. Blaine's third in command was killed a few years ago by rogues. Blaine didn't want to replace him, which meant Adrian, and he had a bigger workload. Due to this, Blaine had put much more responsibility onto Adrian, and he seemed to be enjoying traveling over different states and doing his duty as Blaine's beta and third. It's been an experience, Adrian said. I've traveled through so many packs and I surprisingly haven't met my mate. You'll find her son. Just be patient, Liam said, while shoving his food in his mouth, causing Lena to smack him on the arm at his table manners. Adrian and I sniggered while Blaine rolled his eyes. Let's just hope she's not crazy, Liam added, but quickly moved before Lena could smack him again, making us all laugh. After dinner, Adrian told Blaine that they both needed to make a start on some paperwork and other documents that they had both been ignoring for the past few weeks. The paperwork related to the prisoners we haven't, so they both left to complete the work in the pack prison office. To our agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilbe, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Blaine had dropped me off at Diego's house, which was literally a 5-minute walk from our home. It was no longer awkward or uncomfortable with Blaine and Bryson. The wolves he attacked had survived, and since they were willing to accept his apology, Blaine agreed to leave it as that. It had been a while since I had chilled with Diego, Bryson and Tilly, but I was happy to be able to be in their company and watch movies. It was keeping me occupied while Blaine was dealing with running our pack. He had informed me that he would be home late and to go bed without him. He had shut out our mind link since he really needed to concentrate as I kept distracting him. I could see it was getting dark outside, and I was beginning to feel shattered. I turned to look at the clock and it was already 10 p.m. I had been here for at least 3 hours. Diego, Bryson and Tilly kept insisting on taking me home, but I declined. I could literally see my home in the distance, and they agreed that they would at least watch me walk home. I rolled my eyes but agreed. I walked across the clearing. It was very dark out and the wind was fierce, blowing my hair into my face as I tucked it behind my ears. I pulled my coat tighter across my body. To my left I could see our woodlands. It was strangely quiet compared to the normal Friday night, as usually young wolves would be racing through the forest. As I walked up the steps to my house, I noticed that all the lights were out. I hummed in question, and bit the bottom of my lip. When I opened the front door, I got one foot in and looked around. It was eerily quiet and I felt uncomfortable, but when I heard a creak upstairs, my worry washed away as I assumed Lena or Liam was here, but probably asleep. I walked further in, shutting the door and turning on a small lamp that sat next to the front door. Hearing another creak, I frowned and looked in the direction of where the sound came from. It sounded as if it came from upstairs. Slowly climbing up the stairs, I walked into Blaine's office where I believe the high-pitched sound came from. Walking through the door, I noticed it was empty. I focused on all my senses, but I didn't pick up anything, not a sound or smell. I pursed my lips before rubbing my teeth slightly against my bottom lip. I ignored all of my instincts of fear and shrugged my shoulders, assuming it was nothing to worry about. Letting my guard down, I decided to go downstairs and grab a bottle of water for bed. I made my way out of Blaine's office and was about to descend the stairs when I suddenly felt a presence behind me. Before I had time to turn around, I felt a hand roughly shove me on my back. Not being able to grab the banister in time, I roughly fell down a flight of stairs. As rolled off of the last step, I could barely open my eyes as they felt so heavy. My whole body was shaking in agony. Feeling breathless, I attempted to control my breathing as much as I could while I struggled to catch my breath. I tried to roll over slightly, but the pain radiating through my body was too much. I had broken multiple bones which were already trying to heal, but they needed to be put into the correct place, making it even more painful. I couldn't speak and only moaned in pain as I tried to roll slightly to the side so that I wasn't leaning on my stomach so much. My body wouldn't allow it, and my body froze in fears and the realization that the strong metallic smell of blood entered my senses. I cradled my stomach, which almost felt numb except for few tingles. My breathing was getting heavier and heavier as I realized my baby wasn't moving. I moved my hand slightly down to my groin area, and brought my hand up to see sticky red blood coating my fingers, igniting my worst fear. I attempted to scream, but nothing came out. I felt helpless and trapped. I began to feel the energy drain from my body when I hear footsteps. It echoed and sounded like high heels as someone walked down the stairs and stood right in front of my face. As I laid curled up in a fetal position, I managed to hold on to as much energy as I could, lifting my head up, getting a quick glance of the person standing over me as my eyes began to flutter closed, feeling heavy. "Melissa," I barely whispered before I was engulfed into darkness. Chapter 30. I felt my body wake, yet my eyes stayed glued shut, unable to open. All I could hear was people frantically moving around me until a hand began to stroke my face gently and I unconsciously moved into the comforting hand. "Kenny, can you hear me, sweetheart?" Lena's comforting voice surrounded me as I laid there still and feeling numb. My whole being felt heavy, as if a house had fell on top of me. I moaned in pain as I opened my mouth a little, needing air, my airway feeling constricted. "We need to get her to the infirmary," Lena cried as she kept stroking the hair out my face as I continued to struggle to open my eyes, deciding it was best to keep them shut to not waste any energy I might have. "I'll pick her up as gently as I can. You go get Blaine." Liam ordered. Lena was frantic and was unable to think clearly. His hands carefully go underneath my body, one arm supporting my back and the other my legs. I was engulfed in Liam's scent as he slowly picked me up into his arms. He shifted me a little while walking out the house through the front door. I was immediately met with the freezing cold air as he rushed me towards the pack infirmary. Everyone seemed to be expecting my arrival as wolves hurried around. George quickly ushered Liam infirmary, ordering him to place me on the prepared hospital bed. I'm not sure what happened. We found her at the bottom of the stairs. I assume she lost her balance and fell, Liam said, as he took a few steps away from me, giving George space as he replaced him, putting an arm to provide me with some fluids. Before George could say anything, the door to the infirmary slammed open. I forced my eyes to open, knowing it was my mate. Blaine quickly entered the room and stood next to me, his eyes looking fearful as he stared down at me in panic. It was a strange emotion for me to see, as Blaine never feared anything. My eyes continued to feel heavy, as he cupped my cheek as he repeated my name. I moaned in discomfort while wanting to speak so badly, yet my body refused, and I instead entered his mind, wanting him to know exactly what had happened. "Melissa did this. She was in our house and I didn't realize until she pushed me down the stairs." His eyes met mine as a menacing growl emitted from deep within his throat, his eyes darkening even more as he took a step backwards, not wanting to hurt me in case his wolf took over. He was battling his wolf for control, and I could see it was diminishing rapidly as his eyes flashed between his wolf's and his own. His body language was displaying the true anger he was feeling. His posture was stiff and his hands were balled into fists, and from the amount of force he had put on them, meant that his hands were turning white. All the muscles in his arms were bulging and looked ready to rip through his black shirt as he stood there, his whole body shaking with anger, but he managed to calm his wolf down and slowly approached me. "You'll be all right." He breathed heavily, placing a kiss on my forehead as he gained control of his wolf, wanting to comfort me instead of stressing me out. His eyes showing me a promise that he would deal with the situation later. The doctor was moving around desperately, yanking supplies from cupboards before frantically pulling the ultrasound over to me. George used the ultrasound on my belly and was firing questions at me as he attempted to find a heartbeat. With each question, I answered him through the PacMind link as I was unable to provide him the answers verbally. I slowly started to feel pain, but certain parts of my body continued to feel numb with still no movement from my baby. I wasn't uncertain about how long I laid on the floor before Lena and Liam found me. Blaine was purposely suppressing his emotions from me, but his face failed to cover how panicked and alarmed he truly was. George looked up, staring at both of us before he acknowledged Blaine. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I'm going to have to do an emergency case, Rain. The baby heartbeat is too weak that I don't think she'll make it if we don't act now. You must both be prepared that I cannot promise this will be successful. George's voice sounded unsettled. He feared that our daughter would not make it. My chest began to rise and fall in quick succession as I began to become distressed. I couldn't stop the tears rushing down my face as I looked up at my mate petrified. He looked down at me with the same expression before he quickly masked it. Blaine lowly growled in frustration before he sighed deeply as George continued. Kenny has many broken bones that I will also need to reset, and she has lost an immense amount of blood. Her body might not be able to take the pain at a shutdown, but if we don't, I fear that she will experience a stillbirth. He looked towards Blaine nervously. I cannot promise that either one of them will survive. Goosebumps erupted my whole body, my hands literally shaking at the thought. Blaine was breathing deeply. He was trying to control himself. I want the cesarean done. I whispered, my words coming out hoarse. I looked up at Blaine, who looked down back at me before he directed his gaze at George. What do you need me to do? While you do the cesarean, should I do a blood transfusion to help Kenny heal quicker? George nodded quickly. Yes, it would give us a better chance of them both surviving. Blaine continued to look down at me in deep thought, while George rushed around, ordering a few packed nurses to help set everything up. Blaine sat down next to me with Lena appearing at his side. One of the nurses had set the transfusion up, the long needle burrowing into a vein in his hand, making me feel a little queasy before she did the same to me. I love you and you will both be fine, Blaine promised as he gave me a long-lasting kiss on my lips. I looked at him, my eyes going glassy as I told him I loved him too. George soon began the surgical procedure. He asked me to move to my side so he could inject me in the back with an epidural anesthesia drug to stop me feeling pain. My chest, tummy and legs going numb a short time later. Blaine held my hand tightly as he watched George's every move while he carried out the procedure. He was taking his time, carefully making a cut on my lower tummy. I kept my eyes solely on Blaine as I felt a huge wave of pressure and some tugging, making me moan from the sudden movement. The pressure was there for a few moments until it suddenly went. Blaine shifted slightly in his chair, moving round yet never removing his hand from mine. He was watching intensely as George held the small body of our daughter, who he held in his hands. The room deadly silent as we all waited for a cry that never came. George quickly passed her to one of the nurses, who took her to the other side of the room out of our sight. I gripped Blaine's hand tightly as he stared straight back at me, attempting to send me a reassuring smile. The atmosphere was tense as we all waited impatiently yet silently, all begging to hear a cry, which thankfully came, making me cry in happiness. Blaine's face caught mine, a wide grin plastering his face at hearing his daughter wail. The nurse quickly brought her over, placing my daughter gently on my chest. My hands instinctively moved up, holding her tightly to my chest as her eyes opened wide, staring into mine. I smiled at how beautiful yet how small she was. She's so perfect, Ken, Blaine whispered, staring down at his daughter adoringly. I continued smiling down at my daughter until my arms began to feel weak, my grip going limp and no longer able to support my baby, who laid quietly on my chest. My eyes once again began to flutter close as I fought to keep them open, my ears ringing loudly as my whole body went limp, my system shutting down from the overwhelming pain as it shook my whole body. Blaine quickly scooped up our daughter just as my arms flung down, losing my strength. Dark spots were hiding the light from my eyes as I heard the faint sound of my mate repeatedly screaming my name as I allowed my system to be overpowered, no longer able to hold on as darkness took over, unsure on whether this was going to be the last encounter I would have with my mate and daughter. Don't let the story end, Subscribe to continue our Wolfpack legend.